She's very special for us, a representative of voice in Latin America about feminism, political science, and an inspiration for those who think about the transformation of territory and its processes based on a revision of the feminist literature. So, our first keynote speaker, Verónica Gago, she is a professor in the University of Buenos Aires, the University of San Martin. She's a researcher in the National Council of Technical and Scientific Research, CONITEC. She's the author of several books. I have many names in Portuguese. It would be the Neoliberal Reason, Controversy, A Language of Exile, and more recently, she produced a book with Lucy Cavajero about indebtedness. And her academic production is very important. She addresses themes like popular economy, feminist economy, political theory. She has also collaborated in activist research experiences in the Situaciones Collective, the Ni Una Menos Collective, collectives that combat femicide in Latin America. So, Veronica Gago, if you'd like to compliment, a warm welcome to you, and I will try to get your attention when you have reached 30 minutes of your speech. Thank you so much, Paula. Thank you so much, Priscila. Thank you so much, Raquel Rodnik, for inviting me. And it's an honor to be here participating in these discussions with you. Today, I will be speaking Spanish slowly, and I will talk about a research that we have been doing with Lucy Caballero ever since 2020, the year of the pandemic, but which is connected to researchers we have been doing before and that we are still engaging in. And our work during the pandemic, we had a point of research that was specific and that seems relevant to bring it here today, considering the theme of this Congress and of this session. Basically, I refer to the idea that entitles the book that we have published, which is The House as a Laboratory for the Capital. And we started discussing how the pandemic has configured a new moment and expanded economic and political logics and also sensitive logics of reorganization of the day-to-day life. And we were interested in seeing how the financial sector, through policies referred to as financial inclusion policies, were proposed as a response to the emergency situation that we had in the locations, in the houses, in the neighborhoods, and in the communities. I'm talking from Argentina, and specifically our research is very focused in Buenos Aires, but I believe that there are several exchanges and points of intersection that I have discussed previously with Paula and Raquel that could be a point of dialogue between different countries in our region. So what I would like to bring forth as a starting point is the acceleration during the pandemic of different tendencies that lead us to formulate this hypothesis that the house became a laboratory for the capital. And this means that the household, was put to the test in terms of new modalities of financial intervention. And it created the intensification of non-remunerated labor. So this combination between more intensity in financial dynamics inside the houses and the increase in non-remunerated labor. And the links between the two seems key to us because uh, this space that is uh, apparently private, which is the house, in a place that is a lab and that is completely harassed by financial dynamics of intensification of non-paid labor, and in connection to extractive dynamics of the financial capital at the global level. There are several actors. For example, there is a very interesting piece of work by Ryan Massey that talked about the financialization as a phenomenon that tries to produce uh, uh, territories or enclosures that also focus on the territories that work inside the household as well. And for us, this tendency was intensified during the pandemic. And furthermore, we are interested in signaling how these domestic households stop being enclosed spaces in an emergency situation and became spaces that suffered interventions of financial dynamics. And to go deeper into that hypothesis of the house as a laboratory for the capital, we put at stake the investigation that we had already been doing entitled A Feminist Perspective of Debt, which is a work that we have been carried out ever since 2017, 2018, which basically meant investigating the place that debt and the undertaking of debt had in the territories and in the reorganization of paid and non-paid labor, and also the way in which undertaking debt as a financial technology was incorporated into social reproduction. In several of our countries, the accumulation of uh, debt in public services and in assistance infrastructure have made the private debt an element or a solution that is necessary to contain vulnerability and to solve day-to-day economies. So the increase of poverty allows the undertaking of debt to increase extensively, and the acquiring of debt, as we have been investigating in the last years in Argentina, coincides with the with our country having to once again resort to the International Monetary Fund, and is translated into less public resources and the need to acquire domestic debt to contain vulnerability and to safeguard oneself from accelerated impoverishment. And so we reach the explanation of how debt in the territories is converted into an obligatory, mandatory, compulsory debt. So understanding how these financial devices are articulated with the reproduction of day-to-day life is fundamental because it allows us to understand a capillarization of devices that apparently are abstract and that act at the level of macroeconomics. Uh, and it is fundamental to mark this relationship between the external and public debt and the different financial instruments that include the debts of governments. But it's clear for us to understand, it's important for us to understand how that public debt has become an element of the indebtment of individuals. So concretely, we studied how people acquire debt to pay for water, uh, electricity, and with Silvia Federici, we did an intervention, which is also collective and was just published in Brazil, that talks about how finances have been converted into a financial colonization system for social reproduction, how debt was turned into uh, an instrument for the financial colonization in the social reproduction. And this has subjective impacts that are very significant. And there are several aspects of the feminist theory that are fundamental here when dealing with the dynamics of the vulnerability that cause the obligation for debt and the exploration of family bonds, and also how debt creates an economy of anguish and concern, which are also elements that we work with in terms of the financial exploitation. So this displacement that we started to do, which was put debt at the center of the discussion about the social reproduction, uh, start thinking about debt as a financial colonization instrument and understand the link between non-paid labor and debt, and between debt and the impoverishment of our societies. And it's also key for us in epistemologic terms because it puts at the center domestic debt and therefore domestic territories where that debt is acquired. And this for us has been very important to deal with opening a hypothesis or making way for a broader hypothesis that is related to the pandemic, because the pandemic was the scenario where this hypothesis became more clear and more evident, which is that we are before the restructuring of class relationships that have the reproduction environment as the key aspect. And here we need to understand how this financialization of the social reproduction works, that reorganizes the dynamics to access public services, the dynamics of paid and non-paid labor, and most of all, this colonizer role of finances at the level of daily life. And here, there's a methodological element that we took from Silvia Federici, which seems very important, which is how do we understand the financiarization as a process that is autonomous and has its own logics and rationality, and that tries to capture greed, a political greed that puts certain fights in different cycles and moments of organization. So it doesn't seem to be by chance for us that this invasion of finances into social reproduction is also a response to the feminist fight that has intensified in the last few years and that recognizes caregiving and community-based tasks and the denouncing of the gender pay gap, and also how we also want to fight for economic autonomy beyond patriarchal family heterosexual dynamics. It doesn't seem to us to be by chance that the financial dynamics are responding to this desire for autonomy, this desire for the valuing of historically invisibilized labor. And this also allows us to uh, analyze how the financial sector captures these social invention dynamics and these political struggle processes that I insist put other logics of value in territories that are historically hyper exploited and hyper invisibilized. And in that sense, we were interested in how the houses or the households themselves were one of the spaces where we can understand perhaps the category of the German feminist Maria Mies, who recently passed. She proposed the category of super exploitation, which means there's a difference between the capital not only appropriating the time and the labor uh, as the classic definition of value, but there are moments and territories where the capital uh, tries to appropriate the time, the and the work that are necessary for the production of the livelihoods or for social reproduction, as we call it. Maria Mies works with a perspective that she calls livelihoods. But the time and work necessary for livelihoods, for social reproduction, is what creates a logic of super exploitation. So when we talk about how we can think during the pandemic about these logics of restructuring of the capital that have the house as a laboratory, we take as a premise this idea of super exploitation, which means that the capital is appropriating the time and the work that is necessary for uh, livelihoods and for social reproduction. And this is important and interesting. And we can extend this to what happens in the houses, in the neighborhoods, and in the different domestic territories. And uh, the domestic territories that we analyzed was also in Madrid, and it seems to me that uh, this name of collective territories allows us to understand what's domestic as a territory and not only related to the house, but also to the expansion and rearticulation of the house with community territories and neighborhoods, which is historic in our continent, and it's very visible in the way our urban spaces and suburban spaces are organized and the connections between our urban and suburban spaces with non-urban space.
So we supposed that it's a group of dispositive that include those four places and what allows them to go into the financial technology of those places that made a higher offer of loans and also the gathering of online tickets and different ways how to pay it. Let's wait a little bit because it froze. So let's wait a little bit. I lost connection 1 minute. It stopped talking about the places as financial terminals. I didn't know where I was. So this issue of the places as financial terminals, because it helps to break this idea as a private space, as a closed space, preserved as financial, and this capitalization allow us to think this image as through the inclusion of technological finance and the different ways to bankarization and intervention and digital and finance technology that has been intensifying in our countries during the pandemic times. So, for example, in our Argentina, not only in Argentina, we produce inclusion, finance inclusion policies when they suspend the places tickets. So after the financial crisis of 2008, it comes back to show as a solution for the poor population that already exist and were included in the financial system through that. And that's another thing, because the inclusion financial policies shows including the population that weren't linked in financial disposals. So these ones that are going to be input, what we want that they have intimacy with the system. So this, as a global policy, what allows and what it demands is to produce to this population, they don't have literacy, so in an epistemic way are very strong. So we produce a lot of investigation and prevention, as the work of Anis Ferreira e Paulo Chacada about the impact that we had in the because of the crisis of 2008 and the racial population that affect the incomes. So it explains the appropriation of the global capital. So that's the constitution of what are the most affected population, and epistemically it's fundamental. Lucy Cavallero in this work also we got an image produced by the feminists in the 70s, with the hunt to the factory. Another picture, how to think it's not a closed space. It's a space to produce value. It's a discussion that's very important in the 70s in several perspectives. And when we respond that the women didn't need to go to the factory, just what was interesting in that image to the hunt to the factory is to rethink of how we can reorganize the production environment in those hunts, where the difference from the 70s, we can say that's not a hunt, traditional hunt, that a couple of men and women have as how to receive the payments. So nowadays, as we see as an emergency in a way of organization of these factory houses, is represented by what's monoparental places. So mothers and women that combine reproductive work, community work, and political work organizations. That seems to me that's fundamental if we have this image of to the factory and what means to think the houses as factories. And then we come back to a notion that's important is to finance capture of those places, of this confirmation of the places. So there, I think that the term capture that takes the philosophy that takes the feminist economist Ibsen Garhan, thinking about how the finances are also a dispute of the subjectivity level, how they work in the microscopical and recreative of our habits to return to something that is precarious. So that uh, finances mechanisms incorporates itself in a micro way as a precarious inclusion. So we have a lot of domestic knowledge, financial knowledge of the daily life that are captured by the finances. And seems to me that coming back to the epistemological beginning behind the finances, the political civilization, seems to me that we have to think how this financial colonization of the social reproduction is contesting the unconfining of the places to those heteropatriarchal relationship as a concept of family. So there is a feminist politicization that we have been talking about, and the ways of working the domestic places and the guidelines of the financial and that seems to me that's an important theme. So feminism in its discussion and its theoretic, it's all the time giving visibility to the places, the production of the family, the kitchen, the rooms, the community spaces. So the finances are responding with a capitalization of this way to deconfine what we understood as live. There is a point which is very important, is the boundary between the reproductive work and the godness. When the godness demands a higher work and the godness, it converts itself in a dynamism of the precarious way overall all the women's that should work more to honor their financial obligation. And this idea of financial obligation is covered of moral mandates and guilt and responsibilization about who has the care task. And what seems to me important is how, thank you to a group of debates and feminist fights, we could give the visibility between godness and living and godness and non-paid work. So regarding this issue is the way that during the pandemic, the rent convert, you know, a way of have that. So in Argentina, that was simultaneous to the debate regarding the law of rent, and thanks to the association of the new tenants. And so because of that, we got a new law because of tenants. So we have a permanent production of debt. So this fight of tenants was important to bring that question. In that sense, I can say that it was an important moment to, because it connects itself with pre-existent phenomenon that was mandatory of the places to respond to precarious places, and that converted in an important question during the pandemic time. So the speculation in the Argentina case and dollarization of Argentina introduced inside the places dynamics of speculations and the finance circuits that were speculating with the about the value of the dollar, and refers to the business not as a safe place but connected and invalid because of financial dynamics that were connected, and the tasks of social reproduction were included in those aspects. And another interesting point during the pandemic time, dynamics of taking back the land and the tenants, and all of them showed the impact of that in the social reproduction. And with a specific landmark regarding the genders. So what is interesting to me as a point is how this way and this introduction of financial dynamics implies in a speculation dynamics down, what obligates the speculation in the port sectors. There are parts of this territory that are under the logistics of the homes as the way of survival. So we have distinct speculation around that as points of contact. So when you think the house as a capital lab, so we have this connection between debt, house, and income. So we have to understand how they are, how the women are the one that are more obligated to have the majority of the reproductive work. Why those elements allowed us to understand what's happening in the social reproduction as a strategic field of reconfiguration of these speculative rules of the capital. And as I mentioned, to understand how this financial dynamic through the debt and technologies regarding the financial and exploring sorority and showing the impact of the finances in the social reproduction. So I want to finish with two questions. On one hand, what is interesting to understand the distinct dynamics about the finance strategy of debt, what's happening in several places. What's interesting, and the last thing, what we've been talking with Paula and Raquel to talk about this financial capital as a part of extractive logistics. On one hand, the increase of the rent regarding the salary, and also the debt is a way of extract the value. So the connection of this extractive logistics under the territories, and also regarding the way to recognize work that are not recognized as that, as work. So the territory are recognized regarding politics, mean this financial colonization, in which were more intensified regarding violence. So we can have a little bit some questions.
I will now open the floor for questions. I don't see any in the chat, but I will start by making some provocations that you can comment on. Can you understand my Portuñol? Your Portuñol is perfect. Great. Well, I remembered that one day we had, I was reading the book, one of these books here that you wrote. I thought about a question, which is here in Brazil, when we read territory in the 70s until the 2000s, we used the idea of low income urbanism, like peripheries, and peripheries is also part of the name of the seminar, and that were built with the income of the workers. But when I was reading your books, I thought that we were also talking about an urbanism that was without income, not even low income, without any income. And when I read the book about the house as the laboratory for the capital, I asked, wouldn't it be an indebted urbanism, an urbanism without income and indebted, and just something that we could perhaps think about. And another comment that I wanted to make would be for you to talk about a little bit about who is interested in the finances or in the bankarization as a way of having access to money in informal markets where the financial market or the more traditional market would not have access. And many policies were tested for bankarization, and these policies are always renewing themselves because in the previous panel, we were talking about improvements in the neighborhoods that were paid by the debts acquired by the families. And I thought you could perhaps talk a little bit about this. So perhaps you can start with those two questions. Perfect, Paula. And this idea of indebted urbanism is completely correct. In this book that you mentioned, we worked with colleagues in a settlement, in a favela, in a slum here in the city of Buenos Aires, and they're denouncing an urbanization process which is based on debt. So there's a proposal of the issuing of titles for the houses, formalized by uh, housing projects in the government of the cities, but based on debt. And here we have a connection which is key because it articulates public housing projects in the government of the city of Buenos Aires with the debt of the government in the cities that use these territories as guarantees for taking out loans, for example, with the Inter-American Development Bank and the quote unquote landowners of these houses uh, know that they will never actually own the houses because they only own the debt. And uh, why is it that these houses are a source of debt? So there is a change between self-built houses to houses built by the government, but uh, these houses mean debt, and they know that they won't be able to pay for that debt, and that the banks that are funding the projects will evict them from the houses. So it's a development based on debt, and they, it uses financial des devices for eviction. And this probably derives from this idea of urbanism based on depth, but I was talking about the fact that having a house means acquiring debt in order to not be evicted and to pay the landowner, and how this is added to previous debt. So the correct category would be over indebtedness. It's not just one debt, it's over indebtedness. And uh, the house here is key to see how we can produce this group of debts. And another issue that I have been studying for a long time is that uh, one which you signal, since in our countries we had a bancarization of social policy, which at the same time that they are something that provides reliefs to vulnerable populations and populations that have fought for different types of access to goods and services. The way to respond to this demand is through banks. Major banks mediate public resources and the demands of these populations. So this bancarization of the impoverished populations has also been great business for banks with the guarantee of the state. And at the same time, uh, it has been a part of the discussion in our countries in terms of including in the consumption cycles populations that were previously excluded. So there is an entire dynamics that's very contradictory and ambivalent in terms of what this bancarization of the populations, the more vulnerable population has created. And I want to mention a data from the current situation in Argentina. The government offers credit to pay for debt. So we make the assumption that the population is over indebted, both popular and medium class, and especially for credit cards that are used to pay for several types of expenses. And the money from the state goes directly to the credit card to pay for the debt. So there is a recognition of the level of debt of the population, but what is being offered is more debt. It's cheaper debt because it's funded by the state, so the interest rate is much lower when the state is the guarantor and not the banks. But this money also goes to banks. So we are at a level of debt and a cycle of debt, which, on the one hand, currently we have to measure poverty in our countries. We need to incorporate the indebtedness index because it's not only enough to measure the level of access, we also need to measure the level of debt to complete this definition of what we refer to as poverty. And we see this in Argentina, where we have a record number of poverty in the last 40 years. So I believe that we have a debate between the forms of bancarization and financial inclusion, so to speak, where the state transfers public resources to banks. And at the same time, how can we discuss the origins of this bancarization, which is a very legitimate demand for goods and services in the more vulnerable sectors? Thank you so much. We also have uh, a federal national program here by the name of Desenrola Brasil, which is to get people out of debt, and it provides credit, and it's the same thing. It's the same cycle which you mentioned. We have three questions, and the three of them are related. How can we get people out of debt? The first one is by Kaya Lazzarini. I would like to ask from Veronica, what are the financial disobedience dynamics examples to inspire us? Someone else asks about the feminist movement and the formation of. I'll speak in Portuguese. Is that okay? We have a translation to English if you don't understand me. I would like to know from Veronica about the feminist movement in relation to the political training of women and the place of these practice within revolutionary movements. Here in Brazil, we seem to be behind, and the isolation of this debate causes delays in achievements for women and also in politicization. This question is by Rosa Casquetti. And we have another one. Uh, Good afternoon. As I understand your research, Veronica, the financialization is enclosing in the domestic environment the work and the social reproduction activities. Do you believe that the provision of supporting equipments would be enough not only to reduce the debt of women, but also to expand the territoriality of social reproduction beyond the house to the community and to other spaces? I believe these were the questions. Well, I'll try to comment all of them. I shared the link of a book that was just published in Brazil with the Elefante publisher, which is this compilation that we carried out with Lucy Caballero and Zita Federici of different experiences in Latin America, most of all, but not only, of financial disobedience practices that go from the construction of a collective of loans and the fight for houses and for land. Because what we do when we expand the understanding of these indebtedness dynamic and how they're connected to vulnerability ways that are intrinsic to neoliberalism and the financial capital global policy and how it extracts value from these populations. By expanding what we understand as debt, we can also expand the notion of what are the ways to combat debt. And the ways to combat that debt are fighting for more fair salaries, fight for good quality housing, and this debt has to do with an in demand for infrastructure, right? Of housing, of services, and of resources, but also uh, for income and salaries, for community work, for caregiving work, for domestic work, and this causes the debt to be compulsory and mandatory. So, in order to uh, dismantle the situation where acquiring debt is mandatory to live, we need to dismantle all the ways that all the forms of exploitation that make debt be the main solution for social reproduction. So, how can we think about the social reproduction dynamics? It seems to me that that is the question. How can we discuss the provision of services, the provision of, for example, food? Today in Argentina, what we have been discussing is that most of the debt we are talking about acquiring debt to pay for food, medication, and rent. This is social reproduction debt. It's debt to live. So, how to get people out of debt? How can we guarantee other forms of access and provision of goods and services that dismantles debt as the only possible solution? And for public policies to be a way to get people out of debt that is concrete and effective, not only by adding other forms of debt. And in that sense, when one of the questions, how can people go beyond the houses? When we think about what it means for a place to be indebted, immediately the cartography of the territory of that place is expanded and open. And how is this place related to community work? How is this place related to paid and non-paid labor dynamics? And once we put into question the enclosement of that space, we can advance on that because the financial capital always elects the expanded cartography of the domestic territories. And I believe that in Argentina, it was interesting to have the discussion between several feminist organizations in relation to debt. And the acquiring of debt with the International Monetary Fund in Argentina ever since 2018 coincides in a moment of peak in the feminist movement and its fights and achievements. And at that moment, we were discussing the debt of women who acquire debt to abort and getting abortions as a source of debt for women. So if we connect the discussion of debt with different things in the feminist agenda, uh, is really important for discussing debt, almost as a set of economic violences and discussing in what sense sexist violences that we were uh, protesting were completely related to economic violences and specifically what we call financial violence. And this is how debt makes especially women work more and have a set of maladies, physical and mental, due to these financial obligations, and having a set of gender roles that held them accountable to several things, including paying debt and providing caregiving. So it was very interesting how the feminist movement has opened and popularized this debate about the social reproduction. We will have an additional 2 minutes, And I forgot asking a question by Thais Moreno, so I'll ask it. But I believe that uh, what's most interesting that you're proposing is this coordination between indebtedness and rethinking the domestic environment. But the question, I'll ask it in Portuguese. Verónica, I studied in my master's the financialization going into popular territories through a new renovations program in the peripheries and how the women inserted dealt with debt and a more critical discussion about the dynamics of debt needs to advance in Brazil. And she asks, I would like to hear what you think about the following point. Is it still possible to think about public policies that are not financed in a production mode that is completely financed, since financialization is a global process that encompasses all aspects of day-to-day life? So how can we move away from financialization? And this would be my last question. And if you want to conclude as well. Veronica and Paula, I just wanted to make a comment to say that it would be very interesting to continue this discussion, also expanded in the context not only of South Africa, where we currently have a lot of indebtedness and financialization, but other contexts where we don't have such a strong relationship between financialization and where we see women that are not as indebted, living precariously, but still not indebted, and how we could discuss that in the future. Thank you, Veronica. Sorry to interrupt. Perfect. Well, about the question asked by Thais, I think that is key because, yes, our states specifically are completely articulated with financing and global financing dynamics that oblige public policies to be focused and to follow this logic that we think is the logic of the financial capital of cutting salaries, cutting services, but offering subsidies that are very specific, or uh, offering debt to pay for pre-existing debt. And I believe there is a discussion during the pandemic and as how we can interfere with the public banks, this mandatory indebtedness due to the emergencies. And it's also a very important discussion about the regulation of these financial instruments, like how, like virtual platforms for taking out loans, which are currently the more accessible ones, but are also the ones that charge abusive interest. So I believe that there's not one possibility to disconnect absolutely the states in our country from this dynamic of the financial market, but there is a possibility for these public policies to not follow the mandates of the global capital in its neoliberal sense of taking away and then repairing in a very focused and specific sense that is related to the policies in the 90s in the more classical sense. And about what Priscilla said, I believe that the debt index, it's a debt of increased vulnerability. It is a deeper level of vulnerability that makes uh, or produces this accumulation of neoliberal policies, and debt will appear as the only possible solution. And we also need to decompose other mechanisms of social organization, other economies of reproduction that avoid that debt will be the only way of surviving. This also seems interesting to me for debt to appear as the main element of social reproduction, we previously will need to compose other subsistence and reproduction economies. Because another point that we didn't have time to talk about, but debt is a hyper individualizing device. So the bankarization and the debts are related to extreme individualization. And when there are other elements, other networks, other subsistence economies that allow debt to not expand in the way that it has expanded in many of our countries, it's related to the to preventing these individualization mechanisms from achieving success through other alternatives. And currently in Argentina, for example, we can say there is a high level of debt and also a high level of social and popular organization. And the debt also appropriates community collective work, but always putting the figure of debt as an element of extreme individualization, which is also a very important concept for debt.